Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for asking me today. Sorry, we seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulties, but I wanted to talk about weed control, kind of what's going on in Manitoba right now, and just a little bit of what's coming at us in the future. And I think weed control in the future, I know we're always looking for new herbicides. We've had it fairly easy in the last little while. You know, we've had some really great herbicides. They work really well. We're just, you know, our mode of action is just to our mode of action is to pull into that field with a sprayer and spray, and we do a really good job taking care of the weeds. We've got a lot of herbicide resistance on the way. It's not a matter of if, but when it's coming. We're not going to be able to continue to use a lot of the herbicides that we're using right now. Is there new herbicides coming? Not right now. I think everybody would like to think there's a silver bullet coming, but there may not be. Realistically, there isn't one. There might be, but realistically right now, we don't have anything on the horizon that's going to be, like I said, that silver bullet. So we really need to look at going back to the basics. We need to look at integrated weed management, and that encompasses a number of things. That's, you know, a lot of different things. And but the biggest thing is to grow really good competitive crops. Ultimately, our goal should be to reduce the amount of weeds that see an in-crop spray. So the less weeds we're spraying, the less weeds that get that herbicide, that lessens our chance for resistance to develop. And we want to reduce that weed seed bank. We don't want that weed seed bank to keep growing in our fields, and especially the resistant weed seed bank, because that's just, you know, a whole lot of hurt coming down the road. This is just some slides. These are from Charles Geddes, and this shows the wild oat.
Excuse me, sorry, Kim. I'm going to interrupt you there because your screen sharing was working, but it's not working now. So we want to see your slides. So if you can try that share screen one more time.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to end the show. I'm going to go back. I will share my screen again. Sorry. Try that. We'll share. Okay, what can you see?
Yeah, I think it's just slow. It says it started to share.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Okay. All right. So we can see your slides now. So let's not mess with it anymore. And so the wild oat, the inhibitors one, yeah. The groups 1 and 2 one is showing. Good. Thanks, okay. Kim.
But can I go into presentation mode, or you don't want me to?
You can try.
I can try. Okay, we'll try reading. Sorry, I'm just looking. I'll try it a different way up here. Reading view.
Under slideshow,
I'm just looking.
Kim?
Yeah, presentation mode. It just sometimes we'll go from current slide. We'll try that. We'll see if that works. Does that look? Oh, does that look okay?
There will be a little lag, but it should work. You can proceed. Yeah.
Okay, I'll proceed. Sorry about that. Anyways, this is work from Charles Geddes and from the folks at Ag Canada. Actually, this is actually going back to Becky et al. In 2020, but Charles is continuing this work. And so this is the group 1 and the group 2 resistant wild oats, the ACCAs and the ALS inhibitors. And you can see just by the amount of dots on the prairies here, this is where we do our weed surveys. I'm going to just make a quick mention right now that we are doing our provincial weed survey in Manitoba this summer. These weed surveys are really important. We're trying to do them now on a 5-year basis. We're back a year because of COVID, but we are doing our weed survey in Manitoba this coming summer. So we'll be surveying about 700 fields, and these are crucial in order to get information first on the amount of weeds that are present and the trends that we're seeing, but also we follow it up with a resistant weed survey. We come back and look at harvest time and gather weed seeds and check for resistance. So this is the case for wild oat resistance across the prairie provinces. Manitoba, though, we are number 1. We have 42% of the fields surveyed had both group 1 and group 2 resistant wild oats. So that is, something that is increasing every year. You can see from the original surveys done down here. Hang on a sec, I'll try and get a better pointer for you. You can see the original surveys down here done down in the 2000s, and you can see every time we've done a survey, it's growing and growing. And so we will be doing a survey here in 2020, in 2022. And, I fully expect these numbers to get a little higher as well. When we look at looking at glyphosate resistance, now this is an older slide, but the amount of species that have become resistant to glyphosate over the years is climbing. We had glyphosate, registered in the 70s there. Some of the earliest weeds to show resistance were these Amaranth species, and these are the ones that Rob Golden was talking about. This tuberculatus, that's our hemp, or sorry, our water hemp. Amaranthus pomeroy, that's Palmer amaranth. Here's our kochia that became resistant here in the mid 2000s. And this also in Manitoba, we have Amaranthus hybridus. That's a smooth pigweed. We have that here in Manitoba. It is in our Noxious Weeds Act, so that is something that we are keeping an eye on. It looks very much like many of the other pigweeds. It's not as severe a problem yet as these two that we are very concerned about, but we are watching this one.
Hey Kim, it's Jay again. So I think it may be a lag on your end where your slides aren't advancing because we're still on the wild oat slide, at least for my screen. So what I'm going to do while you're talking, I'm Cass, if you've got Kim's presentation there, perhaps the best way would be for you to load it up on your end, and then Kim can just ask you to advance the slides, because I think we're on the group 9 slide, but I can't see it.
Yeah, okay, it should be about, should be the 4th slide in, if you don't mind. And I can, yeah, I guess you guys haven't had a chance to see that, so we can talk. Yeah, so go, and just while we're filling in, if Cass, if you can just let me know when the slide is up. In Manitoba, we have the Noxious Weeds Act. We have our Tier 1 weeds, our weeds that are not yet present or present in very small amounts or in very isolated areas. And we are, the 3 amaranth species that we are worried about are Tier 1 weeds. So they are, when we find them in Manitoba, they must be eradicated. That is the law, and for good reason. So our Tier 1 weeds are the really, really bad ones, and these are the ones that we do not want to get a hold to take a, to take root here in Manitoba and gain presence here in Manitoba. We don't want them at all. So those are the ones that we're very concerned about, and for many reasons, herbicide resistance is the biggest one. Simply because they're resistant to so many different herbicide groups, especially the water hemp and the Palmer amaranth. And again, like I said, we have a 3rd amaranth on the list there, smooth pigweed. We saw a little bit of it this summer, so we're going to have to evaluate that one. It doesn't seem to be nearly as aggressive as the water hemp and the smooth and the Palmer amaranth, but it can be an aggressive weed, and elsewhere, not in Manitoba, but elsewhere, it is resistant to glyphosate. So it's definitely one that we have to be watching. So we'll be evaluating that one this summer.
Okay, Kim, I have your slides.
Okay, okay, I'll just back up. So so I was on the slide with the number of species resistant to that group 9, and you can see I've circled in red there. The bottom circle is the water hemp and the Palmer amaranth. The next circle upper is kochia, and then we've got this smooth pigweed as well. So just there's a number of species. We're talking about herbicide resistance. If you could go to the next slide, this just shows you water hemp. 4 days after emergence versus 16 days after emergence in the back. So these weeds grow extremely rapidly. And when Rob was talking about closing that canopy, not having bare ground, this is why. When you look at Palmer amaranth there on the right-hand side of the screen, 4 days after emergence, it's already a couple of inches tall. And by 16 days after emergence, like that's not even, that's just past 2 weeks. That stuff is halfway to your knees already. And so very aggressive weeds. And the problem is in certain crops, there's just no products to use anymore, or very, very limited products once it shows up in crop. So the idea is to not have these weeds show up to get a post spray. We don't want to be spraying these in crop. We want to not have them grow, or we want to have them taken care of, using a pre-spray with some residual, that type of thing. We just don't want to be trying to spray some of these weeds in crop, and we definitely don't want them going to seed. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is just quickly to show you the this is a kochia / Russian thistle surveys, again, done by Ag Canada, by Charles Geddes there. And you can see in our 2018 survey over here on the right-hand side of with all the nice bright colors, the red colors there all along this bottom, our border, and in the southwest part of the province. Basically, we're looking at resistance frequency of almost 100% that we're seeing glyphosate resistant kochia. So again, not what we wanted to see. And again, in the 2018 survey, when you look on the left-hand side with some of these dots, you look at the susceptible populations. We look at the glyphosate, which are the green dots, and they're the tiny dots. They're very small. The red dots on here are all the glyphosate resistant populations, and then we see the dicamba resistant, and as well we had cross resistance in a couple of places where we've got dicamba and glyphosate resistant kochia. So herbicide resistance is growing. So our ability to keep using herbicides to get rid of these weeds is lessening. Next slide, please. So this is from a paper from Hugh Becky and Neil Harker. And basically, if we're looking at dealing with herbicide resistant weed management, we've got some strategies here. The top, from growing from top 10 down to number 1, maintain a database. It's an invaluable reference. You have to know your data, know what was sprayed, know what was grown, all that type of thing. You've got to keep good records. And particularly when you're picking up rented land or when land is changing hands, you have to know that. Number 9, strategic tillage, if, when, or where or when needed. This is something that we're going to have to really evaluate. We've struggled with this in the last couple of years because it's been very dry, but going forward, this is something that we're going to have to use. This is a tool we have to be able to use. Field and site-specific weed management, one size might not fit all, and really we can't have that one spray across the farm for all the wheat, one spray for all the corn. We need to do, we need to be much more specific than if we can. Weed sanitation borders are important. That will slow our herbicide resistant dispersal. In crop wheat, using selective herbicide rotation, that's to combat non-target site resistance. The herbicide group rotation, avoiding back-to-back in crop group 1 and group 2. Again, this is specific for wheat when we're talking about group 1 and group 2 wild oat resistance. Herbicide mixtures and sequences are better than rotations. We still want you to use rotations, but we want you to use mixtures and sequences as well. So it's going to get a lot more complex. There's going to be a lot more stuff in the tank. And again, this is where record keeping comes into play. We've got to know what we're looking at for rotational cropping and that type of thing going forward. Pre and post herbicide scouting, know your enemy. So you're in there before, you're spraying the proper chemistry, but you're in there after as well, not just once, but several times throughout the growing season to see, what came through or what came later, that type of thing, and know what's coming at you next year for weeds. Competitive crops and practices that promote competitiveness and natural biological control where that's appropriate. That's, a little harder to do in some of our crops, but, there is still there's definitely merit in that. And number 1, top practice is crop diversity. So these top 2, this competitive crops and practices and this crop diversity, we've got to keep this in mind because we do not have the sprays to rely on anymore. Next slide, please. If we look at our, this is a study by Neil Harker, and this is basically where they looked at doing some very poor practices, which would be something like a continuous barley rotation versus a better rotation, which would be something like barley, canola, barley, peas. So a 4-year rotation versus something like continuous barley. Within those rotations, they also looked at the effects of using short crops versus tall crops, like short cultivars versus tall cultivars, and also low seeding rates versus high seeding rates. So at the bottom end of the spectrum, when you look in this continuous barley, if you're looking at wild oat biomass at maturity, your worst case scenario is a continuous barley, a short variety, and a low seeding rate. You have, a large amount of biomass at maturity. Even within that continuous barley, if you mix it up and you go to a taller cultivar and a higher seeding rate, you drastically drop. If you look at this green bar here in this continuous barley, you drastically drop the biomass. And when you have a better rotation, it all drops again. Like you're looking at a real drop in the amount of weeds that are in those crops when you start changing things up and doing a lot more management. If we go, so again, in this case, if we look at all factors, if we have an increased seeding rate and a tall cultivar and a good rotation, you're looking at a 70 times reduction in wild oat biomass. I mean, that's huge. That's so much more wild oats to be spraying and less wild oats to be developing further herbicide resistance. So if we go to the next slide, please, we look at wild oat seed production. Again, we want to reduce that seed bank in the soil. If this is our continuous barley rotation here on the left-hand side of the graph, and our worst case scenario, which is again our tall or short variety, our low seeding rates, our continuous barley, and you compare that even within the continuous barley, where you have some better agronomic practices, which is our tall varieties and our higher seeding rates, you're dropping that tremendously. And when you look when you're looking at including a more diverse rotation as well, you're dropping your wild oat seed production by 37 times. So again, that's so many more plants that will have a chance to grow and compete in our crops and go on to set seed. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Cass. At the end of the day, diverse crop rotation should be the backbone of your crop planning. Growing the same crop back to back isn't ideal, might be inevitable in 2022. We've got a lot of issues last year with leftover nutrients and that type of herbicide residues and that type of thing. Maybe a lower disease risk this year due to dry conditions, but again, we've got to look at a lot of these factors. Ideally, you match your high-performing crops to your fields with your leftover nutrients, and you need to watch your herbicide residues as well. Many crops are profitable given current commodity prices. And in Manitoba, there is still time to make changes to crop insurance as well. You want to maximize your insurance and minimize risk. And I'll just go through these next slides really quickly. I'm sorry, I apologize, but with the technological difficulties, we're behind now. This is just a graph from Manitoba Manitoba MASC, Manitoba Ag Services Corporation. This is from their MMPP site. And this just shows you basically the crop planted across the top of the graph here and the previous crop down the side on the left-hand side there. And normally if you're planting canola on red spring wheat, that's 101% of long-term yield, so that's good. So this gives you an idea when you're looking at your crop rotation and planning your crop rotation to grow good competitive crops. This is one place to get information where you can look at like what would be a good crop rotation, what will work on my farm. And I think in about 51% of the time canola is planted, or 58% of the time I think canola is planted on red spring wheat in Manitoba. And if we go to the next slide, sorry, this slide is very busy, but this is a snip. We've got some really good information as well. This is from our very capable people with our farm management crew at Manitoba Agriculture. And these are our current costs of our crop production costs. And this year is a really good news story. A lot of these crops are profitable. In fact, most of the crops that we're growing are profitable. Our top 3 crops here that I've highlighted in yellow, canola, hard red spring wheat, and soybeans, that's about 80% of the crops in Manitoba, 80% of the acres that are grown. We want to have more diversity, but again, these will help you with your crop planning, and there's a lot of information in here that you can look at if you're looking at different rotations and different things in order to get a good crop rotation going. And this year, it's like I said, it's a really good news story. We've got most of our crops are profitable, which we don't always see going into the spring. Another source of really good information is our field crop protection guide, or sometimes we just call that the weed guide, but we do have weeds, plant diseases and insects in there as well. Our 2022 guide should be available very shortly, within a couple of weeks. We'll have hard copies available at our 10 service centers, and there will be a copy available to download from our website for free if you'd like a PDF version of that. So, and my next slide, sorry, if you want to go to my last slide, weed control in the future. Basically, we need to look at it's going to be a lot more management. It's not going to be as easy as pulling into the field with a sprayer and spraying something and pulling out and the weed control's done. It's a lot more management. It's a lot more moving pieces. It's a lot more pieces of in the puzzle. There's a lot of info available. Manitoba Agriculture, MASC, industry webinars such as this one, but your relationship with your agronomist, your industry people, and your retail, that is crucial for planning this year and onward, because it's going to get a lot more complex. It's just not going to get any easier. And a final plug, our provincial weed surveys, they're crucial for gathering data on weed trends and resistant weeds. And again, we are going to be doing one this summer. We're planning about 700 fields across the province. So we are looking for people to do some surveying as well. If that's something that anybody is interested in, we'll have some information out about that a little bit closer to the survey date. But we will be across Manitoba surveying, and we will be following that up with a resistant weed survey as well, closer to harvest time or right at harvest time. So expect to see us across Manitoba doing that. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll be around for questions.
That's great. Thanks, Kim.